In everyone, and good morning to all of you. Some of you may recognize me, but I'm basically going to be moderating today's event, or at least being the MC for today's event, which is, here we are, OLLI at Berkeley, and today's town hall is about an extraordinarily important topic, which is combating Asian hate. I know for a long time it dominated headlines and seemed to be every day in the news, and it looks like it may have faded away, but it actually hasn't. It's just its presence in the headlines may not be what it used to be, but it is an issue that is always here. It's an issue that is always of utmost importance. And we have three wonderful panelists here today to help guide us through things that relate to combating Asian hate. I will let each of them give their own presentation to start things off, and then as they're talking, the format will be that you can post your questions or comments or insights in the chat section and I'll be reading them, and I'll field the questions as we get into the second half of today's program towards the panelists, either specifically as individuals or to the entire panel. So feel free to add your questions to chat as we are speaking. So first up of our panelists, we have Russell Jeung, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. Russell, I will now yield the virtual Zoom floor to you.
Thanks, Darren, and thanks, OLLI, for inviting us. I'm glad to be on this panel with these distinguished guests. The issue of anti-Asian hate and combating it, I think, we need to really understand the sources of the hate if we want to root it out. And I'm a sociologist, and what we've seen through Asian American history is that in times of war, such as World War II, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated, and after 9/11, when South Asians, Muslims, and Arab Americans faced detention, deportation, and harassment. In times of war, in times of economic downturn, such as when Vincent Chin was killed in 1982. He was mistaken as a Japanese person by white auto workers who blamed Japan for their economic distress. And in times of pandemic, such as SARS recently, the bubonic plague, Asians face higher rates of racism. We always face racism, but anti-Asian hate spikes during those periods of economic distress, war, and pandemic. And during COVID-19, we had all three conditions. We had COVID-19, where people were obviously fearful of that. We had the worst recession since the Great Depression. And we have this brewing, now heightening Cold War with China. And so those conditions really led to a surge of racism, and we sort of expected it, Asian American scholars. And that's why we created Stop API Hate, to document what was happening and to hold government accountable. So since that time, you can see this shared screen, I hope. Others have done good survey, and the results show that 8 to 45% of Asian Americans have experienced racism in the last year. And with 24 million Asian Americans in the US now, that's 5 million cases of discrimination. So I'm saying this period is one of collective racial trauma for us. It's if we haven't experienced the racism directly, the rest of us experience it vicariously, right? If we see a grandmother attacked, we can't help but think about our own elders in our family. So it's common, it's very racialized. And because we're being profiled, anybody could be attacked. We know people aren't being attacked because they know us individually. People are attacking us simply because of the way we look. Currently, 1 out of 2 Asian Americans feel unsafe because of their race. And this sense of fear is so normalized in the US. I think it's like we don't go out at night. I know my mom wouldn't, feels like she could only stay in certain neighborhoods. And that's really de facto segregation. But it's so normalized that we don't realize that, like in other countries, people aren't as afraid of racism. People aren't as afraid of gun violence. So we've collected data, and the racism aren't all hate crimes, which gets a lot of media attention. But here you can see the types of racism we've been experiencing. On the bottom are civil rights violations. About 11% of the cases involve work discrimination, refusal of service at stores and hotels, being barred from ride shares. 9% of the cases are online, but that's only what's reported. 70% of our young people say they've seen something offensive on screen, and they're on screen a lot. Microaggressions make up the bulk of the incidents: harassment, verbal harassment, being shunned, purposely avoided. But again, these acts aren't micro in their impact. 1 out of 5 of our respondents show signs of racial trauma. That's 3 or more issues, symptoms like avoidance of places, hypervigilance, anger, depression. And the last category is physical assault, being pushed and shoved, having bottles and rocks thrown at us. And then with that, we were coughed and spat upon at such high rates that I actually created a special checkoff category so people could just say, yeah, someone spat on me. And it's such aberrant behavior. And people ask, how do you know racism's on the increase? And I just say, in 2019, you don't hear about neighbors spitting on their fellow neighbor, but it was so common during the pandemic. So that's what's happening. It's not all hate crimes, but we have to get at the roots of the issue that I think are longstanding and historic issues of the yellow and dusky peril that Asians are foreigners, the political rhetoric that's inflamed the racism, and the media representations that reinforce the notion that the Chinese virus is Chinese. So I'll just close here about the racial trauma that I think our community is experiencing. Over 50 studies now, peer-reviewed journal articles, have demonstrated the correlation between discrimination and psychological distress among the Asian American community of all ages. And when asked what's their greatest source of stress during the pandemic, Asians report that they were more fearful of racism than they are of anything else, including the pandemic. So think about that. We're more afraid of other Americans and their hate than we are of a pandemic that's killed over 1 million people, right? That's just how anxious we are and how fearful we are at this moment. So I look forward to the discussion about how we can combat this, both the mental health impacts and the sources of racism.
All right, thank you so much, Russell, for opening our town hall today with your comments. I think, aside from the pandemic itself, I think we're facing a pandemic of hate as well, and it's one of the reasons we're here in this town hall. Next up, we have Lok Siu, who is a professor of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley and also chair the Asian American Research Center, also on Berkeley's campus. Lok, I will yield the virtual Zoom floor to you.
Thank you, Darren. And I just want to say also echo the thank yous to the OLLI organization. It's a pleasure for me to present to an audience that is connected to Berkeley, but that isn't necessarily on campus every day taking courses. So very happy to be here to share just my quick thoughts, around the rise of anti-Asian hate, anti-Asian violence, and then hopefully to be engaged with you in conversation. What I'd like to speak to you today is around the social mobilization that came out of it. And let me just try to share my screen so that you can see what I am. Let's see. Oops. Slideshow. There you go. Let's see, that works. Oops. Well, this will do, if that's okay. So I think what we saw happening at the time of all the rise of anti-Asian hate after the pandemic, we actually saw an immense, outrage, from Asian American communities. I think it was really the first time, of this generation where the US community witnessed the kind of massive galvanization of Asian American communities that came out to protest against anti-Asian hate. I think this took the American population by surprise to a large extent. And some of the ideas was sort of the overwhelming perception of Asians as being quiet, passive, politically sort of complacent. That sort of broke all of these stereotypes, the kinds of mobilization that happened during 2021 and into 2022. What we have, are some of the crucial images that I want to capture here, around the mobilization that is distinct of this sort of mobilization is a real sort of cross-racial and cross-generational kind of mobilization that you see here. Whole families, entire families and generations, were really brought out, into the public sphere to protest the Asian American violence, the anti-Asian violence here. And again, you have massive. And this is across the country of that were motivated, especially by the spa shootings in Georgia. Really, right after in March, we began to see massive mobilization to an extent that I don't think we have witnessed, since the 1980s with the Vincent Chen killing, and before that, the 1960s. And I think 1960s is a better comparison in some ways of it. And I do want to talk about how did this, what seeded this kind of social mobilization? And I do want to take a step back to say, we might think of this as sort of the current instance, or maybe the unprecedented instance of Asian American mobilization. But really, what made this possible were seeded in the 1960s. And, during the 1960s, we had, a combination of factors, including the post-1965 immigration policies that really made the Asian American population explode in numbers, and really shifted, Chinatowns, ethnic enclaves, urban cities became, you saw the increase, of Asian American population here. And also, we saw the American-born population of Asian Americans sort of coming to an age where, their consciousness was raised around issues of discrimination, injustice, social, really the racism that Asian Americans experience. One of the ways in which these social movements and ideas manifested itself is through education reform. And this was a really crucial social movement that set the basis, for the future movements as well. We had the Third World Liberation Front. I think many of our members probably in the audience might have been there at the moment, where in the 1960s, there was just massive mobilization by the students, on the campuses of Berkeley and San Francisco State, and also UCLA, demanding an education, educational democracy, that we're addressing the different populations of African Americans, Asian Americans, Chicano, Latinx communities, and also Native Americans. And so this began the formal institutionalization of education and research and teaching around these communities. And that really became the source of, critical thinking, pedagogy, and just the generation of books and articles that have come out of that, has been tremendous and really shaped the ideas, of what these communities are. And up to this point in the 1960s, they were pretty much excluded from our idea of who belong in the nation. And, these fields actually made an incredible inroad, into American society, and has sort of been consistently changing the ways in which we think intellectually, socially about Asian American populations, as well as other racial minorities, in the United States. Another thing that sort of came out of that movement, there's an incredible energy of American-born generations and the newly sort of arrived immigrant populations. And they began sort of really establishing a number of community-based organizations that are still in existence today. And they are addressing a number of issues. They continue to be extremely active. the Asian immigrant women's advocates, self-help for elderly, Asian American advancing justice, the Asian Law Caucus, Chinese for affirmative action, IBASI, Asian Health Services, which was really critical during the period of the pandemic to address the health concerns of Asian Americans. All these were founded, during the 1960s and 1970s. And in fact, I want to just give a shout out to Russell. I think he's being too modest, but he was one of the key people, along with the Chinese for affirmative action and Asian American equity, that form, the Stop AAPI movement here. And you can see that, these are roots, based in San Francisco Asian American Studies Department, the Chinese affirmative action, etc. So these institutions, social institutions, were really crucial in sort of revitalizing and activating Asian American movement here. The other part of it too is that there was quite a bit of advocacy that was being done since the 1960s and 70s. And, not only were Asian Americans sort of working in various social movements and gain knowledge through those social movements, like the redress movement, the Japanese redress movement, the Lau v. Nichols Supreme Court case, which established bilingual education, bilingual publications. There are also, of course, the Vincent Chin mobilization, and then the Wen-Ho Lee case, in which he was accused of being a spy on behalf of China. And we see this also emerging again, in current day. But, these are sort of the experiences of people who have been working on these issues and that are now sort of coming back, in full to address the current situation. In some ways, a return to what to the former era. I think some people see it as a neo-Cold War era, in which the Asian Americans find themselves. And I think I'm going to stop there. I think I've taken up my time, Darren, but I'm happy to talk later on, around what is the future, of the Asian American movement going forward. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I think it was enlightening for so many people to realize there were so many organizations that have been historically created and helping with the battle against combating, well, not the battle against, but helping with combating Asian hate. We have one more presentation left, and that's going to be Aarti Kohli. She's the executive director of the Asian Law Caucus, which in fact was just mentioned in Lok's presentation. So Aarti, I will now yield the virtual Zoom floor to you.
Thank you, Darren. It's a pleasure to be here as a Berkeley alum. I don't think it's overstating the case that I actually don't think I'd have my job and parts of my career were it not for my education at Berkeley. Although I was not an Asian American Studies major, I took a lot of Asian American Studies classes and really became politicized at Berkeley. And Lok, thank you so much for teeing up the introduction to my organization, which was created in the early 70s, or 50 years old, by activists from the people who were activated, in that time in the 60s, during the Third World Liberation protests. So our mission is to protect and defend the rights of low-income Asian Americans. And I think one of the challenges for many sectors of American society is they don't realize that we have a significant population of low-income and underserved Asian Americans. There is this model minority perception of we're all well-to-do, doctors, engineers, professionals, and actually of all ethnic communities, we have the biggest wealth gap. So we have some of the most privileged and wealthy folks, and then we have some of the poorest folks who are struggling with poor outcomes on whether it's health access or education access, all kinds of different indicators. So let me tell you a little bit of about what we do, and then I can get into what our work on anti-Asian hate in particular. So we have three buckets of work. We do economic justice work, immigrant justice work, and protecting democracy. In our economic justice work, we work with low-wage workers, people who are restaurant workers, Uber and Lyft drivers, people who are often struggling to make ends meet and then are dealing with sometimes not being paid, not being treated fairly at work, not being given breaks under the pandemic, basically not even being able to access their benefits through the state of California because the California had no language lines. And we ended up getting a landmark settlement on language access from the Employment Development Department that impacts 7 million Californian workers. So this is an example of actually how we do our work. So we do a lot of direct legal service, will represent people and often a lot of outreach to communities on the ground to let them know what their rights are. Through that, through our ear to the ground and seeing what's happening, we develop policies, local and state and sometimes national policies that we think that need to change, and develop our impact litigation. And we do a lot of impact litigation, often in partnership with the ACLU. And so we have a really holistic model of how we approach change, but our ultimate goal is systems change. Okay, so I am South Asian. I was born in India, and post 9/11, I saw what happened, particularly to anybody who was perceived to be Muslim, including Sikh Americans were some of the first who were killed and blamed, and scapegoated for 9/11. And so when I started getting anecdotal reports of the harm that was coming to our communities, and the media was reporting it, and I knew what was coming. We had been here before. So I gathered some colleagues and convened what has now become an Asian American Leaders Table. And it is leaders from across the advocacy sector, the nonprofit sector, from across the country. And sometimes these orgs are very tiny. They're like 2 people. We're very privileged. We are now one of the largest civil rights organizations in the country representing APIs. And so I felt like it was our duty to step up and support each other and our colleagues. And so we came together, the leaders across the country, to really grapple with how do we work on this very intractable issue of hate, which obviously didn't start with Asian Americans and is not going to end with us. But at this moment, we were, primary targets. Our communities were primary targets. So we focused on a range of issues. One was just basically rapid response. And I still remember getting the call 1 hour after the shootings in Atlanta. And the leader of a large Asian American organization in Atlanta, Advancing Justice Atlanta, was a colleague and a friend. And she called me and she said, Aarti, I've never encountered this. I don't know what to do. What am I supposed to do as a leader? And so I actually called in people who had worked with the South Asian community after shootings. There was a mass shooting in a Gurdwara in Wisconsin, and people who had experience with rapid response. And so we created a checklist of everything you need to do with community when you are encountering this. One is you have to really control the narrative. The narrative has to come from impacted communities. And what we realized in Atlanta is a lot of the families, because of the immigration status of some of the victims, didn't want the victims' names publicized. They wanted to keep some things private. And as advocates, we have a victim-centered approach. And so, we were the firewall between the media and the families. Also, law enforcement. There were different levels of law enforcement engaging. And that can be, if you have the Department of Homeland Security and you've got a family with a, immigration status in question, like that's actually intimidating for the victims and their families. So we really had to show up as advocates for the family and the families and center their needs. And that's what we were, helping the Atlanta folks, guiding them towards that. Also, you had the president coming to town. And people on the ground often don't have the luxury of sitting down and saying, well, what are my policy proposals? They're in the middle of crisis. So as a table, we were able to support them in thinking about, well, what are we going to ask for at this moment? And at this moment, it was really important to ask for investment in our communities, because here's the thing, the crisis is a moment in time, but in order to actually meet the needs of communities, you need consistent support. You can't just get support at that moment in time. So let me actually share something a little bit more closer to home and more recent. We were involved, if you recall, there were shootings in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay, which were very tragic. The shooters were actually Asian American, and the victims were in Half Moon Bay in particular. There were Chinese farm workers and Latino farm workers, and so it was really awful. I still, on Sunday, I was helping send information to Monterey Park to advocates who were supporting communities there. And then Monday, I started hearing about the shooting in Half Moon Bay and realized that although it's only our offices, we have offices in Oakland and San Francisco, it's only about 45 minutes from our office or 15 minutes from our office, we actually didn't know of any Asian American organizations in Half Moon Bay, and even just immigrant serving organizations. So I started looking to, colleagues and trying to find out who's there in Half Moon Bay. And it got connected to the local orgs who were, once again, it was chaos. And in the beginning, we didn't actually even know how many victims there were, what their ethnicities were. What we did know that there were surviving, particularly Chinese farm workers who did not speak English. And so, and I think Santa Clara County folks and the advocates there were doing their best. They told me, we're spending time with them, but the language access and the cultural competency was just missing. And so we, wanted to be very collaborative. And what we had going on was this rush on the Asian American community side to say, we need to do to for the Asian American victims. And, what we ended up doing, and I really encouraged the Asian American community to think about this, is that one, you can't do a GoFundMe without local partners. You are not on the ground. So you gotta work with folks on the ground. That's essential. Two, we can't just do things for our communities. When there is harm across communities, we've got to do it with other communities. So one of the first things we did is we put a solidarity statement out with Latinx and Asian orgs saying, we stand together on this. And the GoFundMe is for all victims, regardless of race. And so that was very important for us, I think, to establish trust and relationship with folks on the ground. We also went in, and one of the other things we realized was like one of the biggest challenges for the victims was housing, because the shooting occurred in not only their workplace, but that was their home. So farm workers often live on trailers at the farms, which, by the way, were completely unacceptable in terms of housing conditions. And it highlighted a really deep need in that region for fair, safe housing for low-wage workers. And so, this is back to my point about, yes, you can meet the needs of people at the moment in crisis. You can do what you can to support them, whether that's mental health support, whether that's economic support to support like shipping just so tragic bodies back to the home country, money for survivors. And you can't stop there. Often these tragedies lift up long-standing inequities. And so you need long-range investment and work in those regions. And one of the challenges for Asian Americans is our sector is very underinvested in. As nonprofits, basically, if you look at foundations, 0.2% of foundation money goes to our communities. And that's because there's this perception that there is no need, and which is false. And so I think, there is a lot of emotion and fear and anger in Asian American communities right now. I think what is troubling for me is that it's also leaving us rife and open for messages from the far right wing. So although, you would think, well, if we're talking about anti-Asian hate, we're talking about white supremacy, people would be opposed to white supremacy. Yes, and the message coming from white supremacists is, oh, this is not white supremacy, it's other people of color who are hurting you. And the messages to our communities is, so there's a lot of anti-Blackness in the messages going to our communities. And between this issue of safety and policing, which has been really politicized, and the issue of affirmative action, there's consistent messaging to our communities to say, you are being harmed by other communities of color, and you should align with actually the far right on these issues. And so I think we have to be very careful about how we talk about these issues, and the work, we've got our work cut out for us as advocates in terms of engaging with our communities. And then we did publish a report, just very quickly, if people want to get in the weeds on this, about lessons that we have learned from the different crises. And unfortunately, we've had a series of different crises. And some of the recommendations is, creating a rapid response ecosystem that can be mobilized in times of crisis, and creating a space for people to learn and strategize, and to really build cross-racial solidarity in communities across the country. And then really invest in political education and organizing within our communities, because we have also, we're the fastest growing racial minority in this country, and we have huge influxes of new immigrants, often who don't have the context and the racial history of this country. And so it's really important for us to spend that time with our communities to help them understand how we got here.
All right, is that everything, Aarti?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for that, for giving us, filling in a lot of specifics, going from Russell's kind of broad-based overview and then going into the specifics was the perfect way to do this. I'm going to go right into the questions. I've been reading them in the chat. We have a question here, for instance, from Linda about education that Lok very nicely answered in the chat, but I'm going to kind of amalgamate these questions and direct this at all three of you, and I'll ask you in the order that you presented. So all three of you in one form or another talked about education. Education is a key to this. It may not be a classroom, it might be, community-based education and things like this. But as you were talking, I was thinking, I teach a class on Southeast Asian politics, and these are Berkeley students, they're undergrads, and most of them had no idea what Southeast Asia was. Aarti, you described yourself as South Asian. I would hazard a guess that most Americans don't know what South Asia is. They might think, oh, does that mean China? What does that mean? So even basic things like that aren't really well known. So I'd like to hear from all three of you, like if we're going to reform education or we're going to offer an ethnic studies curriculum, could you give me maybe like what's in your top 3 wish list for things that we need to put on this, the educational reform list, or the top 3 things you'd like to see people learn that could help us combat Asian hate? And Russell, I'll start with you since you presented first.
Thanks, that's a great question. So there's a lot of proposals now to require Asian American studies, and that's great, but it can't just be the food and fun multicultural curriculum that's often taught, right? Because that's sort of superficial. And actually, young people recognize it's sort of cringeworthy if all we talk about our history is that we have good foods or we can dance well, right? And so what I prefer and recommend is that we have to, if you're going to introduce Asian American studies or ethnic studies in K through 12 curriculum, you really do need to talk about the role of race and racism in shaping our communities. That there's a whole movement to not discuss race, right? But we do need to proactively confront it head on, have those difficult conversations to talk about how race has impacted us on the interpersonal level and on the institutional level. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we have to talk about Asian Americans as being active agents in resisting racism, that we're not just passive victims, that we're not just a faceless community, but we're a diverse community that has always resisted the racism we've experienced. So I think that's a key point, is that you have to show the structures affecting us, but you also have to show our humanity, our full humanity. And I guess, thirdly, I think what I want students to know is not just our history, because that's been the focus, but again, ethnic studies is interdisciplinary. Ethnic studies, again, teaches about our full humanity, so it includes our literature, that we have narratives, it includes our issues, it includes our joys. So I think if you're going to introduce curriculum about Asian Americans, don't just sort of pigeonhole us into certain categories. Oh, here's a racial minority, they have a story of racism and overcoming it. No, let's give the full picture of our communities.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Russell. Lok, would you like to add to the discussion? Any suggestions?
Yes, I think Russell covered some of the key themes already. So I'll just supplement what I think can be added to it, not to replace it. Well, one thing that I think is crucial, as you had mentioned, is this kind of global perspective, right, that we don't even have. And, we think, unfortunately, a US education is kind of, in fact, parochial. Oftentimes we get a very parochial kind of understanding of primarily focusing on the US and not necessarily understanding how global kind of geopolitics interactions actually have an effect, on domestic politics and domestic interethnic relations. And so we see this unfolding. Definitely, during this era. I saw in the question that appeared in the chat around the political circumstances of the time, the context of the time. And when you think about what broke during the pandemic, the anti-Asian hate, it's a combination of the pandemic, but there's also a very strong US-China competition that actually was, really stimulating so much of the antagonism and animating the antagonism. And so I think we owe it to ourselves to understand how Asian American populations came to be in the US in the first place. Much of it has to do with war, abroad, like the Southeast Asian communities that brought them to the United States. It's about the labor needs and, where the labor is to be found in Asia. I mean, you're talking about even the very beginnings of the railroad workers of the Chinese, in the US, but also the tech workers of today, that are coming from South Asia, Taiwan, Korea, places like that, that there are these global components, political economy, and that shapes the influx of immigrants, but also the treatment of immigrants, as well as the policies against them, right? So that's an important, necessary aspect of tying the global and the domestic. The other thing that I think is also around the interraciality component, and to think of racism as a structure that not only affects Asian Americans in a very isolated, bounded way, but that really, the ideas that shape who Asian Americans are, how they're positioned in society, are always done in relation to Black, Native, Latinx, and other communities. And so, that idea of how taking the issue of affirmative action, for instance, that I think Russell brought up, that's a triangulation effect, of pitting Asian Americans against other students of color, and white, and what is unspoken are the white students as well. And so there's a triangulating kind of conversation going on, of how to position one another and to establish the kind of tense relationships as well. This idea of pitting communities against one another that Aarti also talked about, right? During the media, the specularization around specifically, Black Asian violence, when really they make up a very small portion, of the whole set of violence against Asians during the time. And my last point is, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I teach food, food studies, and I want to say that we can't assume students to come in with an already heightened, social consciousness. I think the job that often we do as educators is to meet them where they're at, and to begin to sort of deepen their understanding of the political culture within food studies, or popular culture. And from there, when you pique their interests, then they can be expanded into other terrains that are more difficult, to grapple with, these questions, more complex to deal with. Not that, not that any of the food studies, there is sort of food justice movement as well, or, around popular culture. There's a whole other angle, of inequities that are happening. And so I think my approach pedagogically is always to meet the students where they're at, and then kind of raise their consciousness about the deeper issues of the political structures, the cultural ideas circulating in ideologies, and the social relations, embedded in them.
Right. Thank you, Lok. Aarti, would you like to add anything to what's already been said?
Just briefly, I +1 all of that. I'll just say that one key piece, well, as a lawyer, I feel like it's really important for people to understand that post 65, when the world opened when the United States allowed Asian Americans to migrate, like that happened as a result of the activism in the civil rights movement. I think it's really important for our communities to understand that our, the privileges that we've gotten have been fought for by other communities, and particularly the Black community. And so, and that we do have a history of cross-racial solidarity, and then we have, people like Grace Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama, who held Malcolm X when he was shot, and was a organizer in New York. The history of these, especially women, is often not told, and I think it's really important to include their stories. And then one other piece is we work a lot on national security right now. I'm very concerned because the China threat is leading to a lot of discrimination and investigations of Chinese scientists. There's a real chilling effect in academia in terms of researchers and scientists who are working with China. There is just a lot of fear, and there have been prosecutions by the government, basically based on inadequate and false evidence. And so I can't emphasize enough how important it is to study Korematsu. to look at what happened post 9/11. All of these and baseless, prosecutions, incarcerations, like people lost lives, property, and we just had the Muslim ban. And this Supreme Court justice had the temerity to say that this has nothing to do with Korematsu. It's like, this is the same. Muslim ban was just a repeat. And so to think that we have gone beyond that, that's not true.
Yeah, can I add to what Aarti just talked about in combating anti-Asian hate and the growing U.S. Antagonisms with China? I think, after COVID, clearly people were afraid of COVID, and that created a backlash. But I'm actually more fearful if there's any conflict with China, that Asians in the US would face an even sharper, more harsh backlash. Because what's happening now is that both parties are trying to outcompete each other around China competition. I think there's proposals and bills now to require every federal agency to have a point person to investigate Chinese interference. And those bills just, again, sanction the surveillance, the racial profiling of Chinese with any kind of relationship. It could be an economic relationship, a political relationship, and a familial relationship. So if we simply communicate with our family in Asia, we'll become suspect and then profiled, and then possibly, like during World War II or after 9/11, face detentions, deportations. There's all these land laws now that are being proposed that, again, just particular groups singling out nationalities, Chinese, North Koreans, Russians can't buy land. And so this type of racial profiling, this scrutiny is really chilling. And unless we combat it now, unless we temper the antagonisms, I'm just really fearful of another surge of racism against us.
Thank you for adding that, Russell. I would like to go to the next kind of amalgamation of questions here. There's a couple of questions about the current political climate and has the current atmosphere unified the Asian American community, the AAPI community. All of you touched on the idea that the AAPI community is itself very diverse. But one of the things, for instance, and you can see it on any college campus, you can see it in the communities, frequently people, if it becomes a community-based issue, it's like, well, that's not my community, so that's not my issue. Education is certainly one way that we can familiarize this. We do have, AAPI Heritage Month, but that means for the other 11 months, are we supposed to just let it recede into the background? So I guess the question here is first of all, has this helped to forge a community? We had another question saying, would it be helpful for all oppressed communities to come together as one big community? And then there's also this really large question, which is, how do we, whether it's through education or anything else, how do we get people who are not part of the AAPI community to see this hate as an issue that is very much something that should be a concern of their life as well? How can we get, how can we get people involved? What can we do? And I'll go back through. I'd like to, all three of you have a chance to answer this question. So I'll start again in the same order people presented, and I'll go with you first, Russell.
Well, I've seen the movement to be a very pan-ethnic one. So I really appreciate Aarti's leadership and the South Asian leaders who addressed stopping AAPI hate, because again, they had all the experience after 9/11 of Islamophobia. And we've really learned from that experience and built on the leadership of people like Aarti, like Manju, who helps found Stop API Hate. So I personally have really benefited from these previous movements, the San Francisco State, Berkeley student movement, the Vincent Chin movement, the fight against Islamophobia, all those movements we've learned from. And that's why this current Stop AAPI Hate movement that Lok talked about has been so pan-ethnic. And I think we've learned, it's clear, we're seen as outsiders, we're perpetual foreigners, and that's what's bringing us together, the common exclusion of our communities, right? And I think it's important for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community to come together around its particular issues. And then the way we bridge to other groups is to empathize and to share our stories that others also feel excluded. Others are also racially profiled. Others are also experiencing mass shootings. And so I think that sense of empathy, sharing our stories is a way we connect and go beyond just being an Asian movement to a broader national movement against gun violence, a broader movement against racism. So I think we have to do both, and that we have to organize our own communities and we have to continue to connect with others to build a national movement. I just want to wrap up, anti-Asian hate isn't our problem as Asians. It's other people's problems with us. So they're the ones who are responsible for their racism. They're the ones who have to address their fears and anxieties. I'm arguing the yellow peril fear isn't people's feelings about Asians. The yellow peril fear that people have is their own insecurities, their own concerns about America's economic standing, its moral position in the world. And so America has to confront its own racism in order to stop anti-Asian hate. We don't have to fight to belong. It's others who need to accept us. At the same time, though, the Asian American community, we have to address our anti-Blackness, like we've been talking about. We have to address our own issues. But yeah, this broader issue of anti-Asian hate, I'm placing the onus on others, not our community. It's not our problem to gain acceptance and belonging.
Well said. Thank you for that, Russell. Lok, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I do think I want to acknowledge that there are continued, and sustained efforts to build cross-racial alliances. Back, even as far back as Frederick Douglass, speaking against the Exclusion Acts, against the Chinese. And so, we seem to forget. I think there is a strategy of erasure, of these kinds of ongoing coalitions and ongoing relationships. We tend to think of really our constructions or even racial groups are very isolated and bounded. And that's not the reality. The social reality is that we are continually interacting with one another, learning about each other, and really mobilizing on certain issues. And I'm thinking about, really the work of, the Black Lives Matter. Asian Americans were involved, in mobilizing around that. The issue of the southern border, with Central Americans, the Japanese American community in particular has been really active in addressing the incarceration of the families, Latinx families, in the border of Mexico, US. So there are just these instances, I think, that don't get the media attention or the popular understanding, that is required. There's a lot of it's there, it's present. I think we just need to elevate them as well. And I, unfortunately, the owners of the work of bringing those to the foreground, are kind of falling on many of these of our allies and these communities. But we need to insist that they're there, that in fact, there are anti-Asian violence, is connected to anti-Black violence, is connected to anti-Latinx violence and Native American. And I think that we need to think of it as a structural problem, an ideological issue, not an individual one.
And that is exactly how we approach it in the advocacy sector. Our work is never done alone. And it's there are specific issues like language access, and that we work a lot with mainly API in some Latinx groups in terms of pushing for policy change on that. But on a range of our issues, criminal justice in particular, we always have multiracial coalitions, and that's you're just not going to get things done alone. Historically, we've been a very small community. I will say we're projected to be 10% of the US population in a majority minority country by 2050. So we are going to wield quite a bit of power. And I think one of the things that we're trying to impress upon our allies is you're not going to actually be able to move forward a progressive social change without our communities.
Thank you for that. We are amazingly already at 11:25, which means we only have 5 minutes left. And I'd like to give all of you a chance to kind of just, I was going to say it this way. I'm kind of an inherent optimist in everything. And I was going to say, I know we're talking about combating Asian hate, but I was going to ask each of you if you had, if you could name something that gives you a sense of hope that we can actually combat Asian hate, that things will come out of this, whether it's a personal anecdote or a story or an example. I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot. If that doesn't work, then if there's any one last thought you'd like to share with the OLLI folks before we start wrapping things up. We do have 5 minutes. I'll give each of you about a minute to share whether something that there's optimistic you can leave it with, or something otherwise you'd like to leave us with, so that we can walk away with knowing this can happen. So again, I will go in the same order that everyone presented. So Russell, I'll turn to you first. Oh, you're muted, Russell.
What's helpful for me is that I see Asian American families having race talks with their kids and with their elders. And we can learn a lot from our elders about how to deal with trauma, how to be resilient, how to press on. And with our young people, I think they're really learning how to empathize, right? That as they get bullied, as they see the hate, they recognize that it's wrong, and then they can empathize with other racial groups that also, again, face that same type of racial profiling and hate. And so I think that empathy, the learning from our elders, are great ways that we as a community can heal, and then share with the broader American community about how to heal these racial fissures that we face.
All right, wonderful. Thank you for that, Russell. Lok, would you like to add anything here?
Yes, I'll just say that, this particular moment, I am really amazed by that Asian Americans are now on the radar of the national consciousness. These questions, these forums, the workshops, the lectures that we're giving, it has really had an effect, on transforming the way we think of Asian Americans now, that we're understood as a community that really, the resilience of the community, but also the challenges that we face. I think for the first time, we're finally kind of raised to the national platform to talk about these issues openly, because for a long time, I think we've just been sort of swept aside, as insignificant. And I think, the pan-ethnic, pan-racial, multi-generational sort of voices that have come out have really made that difference. And I see that in my students. I see my students, in the classrooms, who are much more engaged and attuned to the challenges of Asian American communities. And, they're no longer afraid to speak. They're no longer afraid to say, I am experiencing these forms of discrimination, these forms of racism. And that's hope for me, that I see really, it's not just this generation, but it's going to have ripple effects for the next, for the next decade or two. I think we'll have even more of a massive mobilization.
Okay. Thank you for that, Lok. Aarti, would you like to add anything here?
Yeah, I'm just constantly inspired by our clients, whether it's the Chinese American grandmother who led the organizing at Yang Sing for restaurant workers, limited English speaking, but completely, engaged and fighting for her rights along with her fellow workers, or more recently, our clients who were part of a hunger strike at a detention center in the Central Valley. Folks really fighting in very difficult circumstances, but persevering. And so I just, that's what keeps me going, is just looking at the resilience and fortitude of folks facing very challenging circumstances.
Thank you so much for that. And amazingly, we're at 11:29. So the first thing I want to say is I want to say to Russell and Lok and Aarti, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for the work you do and for taking the time out of your day and just sharing your thoughts and insights with everyone here. OLLI folks, this is a 1 hour event, but don't let it just be a 1 hour event. Let this be the opening of some exploration and some dialogue. And who knows, maybe in the future, we can have our 3 panelists back to talk more about these things. But for now, it's 11:30, everyone. That means we have to get on with our days. So take care, everyone. And thanks once again to our wonderful panelists.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.